Hey guys, and welcome back. This is episode number 3 about the Zabbix, about the Zabbix configuration, installation, the manuals, all of the beautiful stuff around this monitoring solution. In a previous video, we installed the Zabbix server, the latest one, LTS 4.0, on our virtual machine on the same computer with CentOS 7.6 using MariaDB database. So if you're still new here and you're struggling to get your Zabbix server up and running, then just go back to the previous video and we'll definitely help you. But for today, the next steps. We're slowly making small steps to being an expert and feeling very comfortable in terms of the Zabbix server or Zabbix monitoring solution. So today we're going to talk about how you can and how you should install a Zabbix proxy component. You should know that Zabbix has a Zabbix proxy component aside from the server, but let's talk a little bit in more details why and when you should use a Zabbix proxy. First of all, the requirements. Very similar as for the Zabbix server. It does require a Linux machine. So in our case, it will be again a local host, CentOS 7.6. It could be a Debian, it could be Ubuntu, or any other Linux machine. The second thing, Zabbix proxy also requires a SQL database. Supported ones are, again, MySQL, MySQL Forks, IBM DB2, PostgreSQL, or Oracle. Or for the proxy, we do also support a SQLite database, which is just a small kind of one file database, which runs pretty fine on small installations on embedded systems, as example. So why do we need a proxy? First of all, Zabbix is pretty good monitoring software to monitor multiple remote locations. Let's say you have branches in different cities, or those might be even different countries, and you need to monitor all of them. It might be quite complicated to install and even more maintain a separate monitoring installations in each of those locations. So instead, by using Zabbix proxy, you can monitor all of those places in different cities and countries within one installation of the Zabbix server, which is pretty awesome. And let's get actually a bit more in the details. So let's say we have our headquarters here as example, and then we have some other city here and one more here. And we need to install, let's say this will be the Zabbix server, this will be the proxy 1 and a proxy 2. Where we install them, they do have a database, and there's also an option, how do you want to configure Zabbix proxy? It could be an active one, let's say this will be an active, which means that all of the connections are outgoing from the Zabbix proxy to the Zabbix server using the port 151, which is a listening port of the Zabbix server. The second option is having a passive proxy, which means that Zabbix server will be responsible to connect to the proxy, send the configuration, and file for the data. This one, the active one, is like most widely used and kind of recommended because, well, think the proxy connects to the Zabbix server, requests the configuration, does all the monitoring, and then simply sends the data back. What's the benefit? We offload our Zabbix server. So all of the things are happening on the proxy. Proxy is responsible to collect the data from the agents, get the data from network devices, databases, applications, some web pages, and then simply send already gathered data to the Zabbix server. Then about the database, what's the point? Yeah, we do have a Zabbix server with a database where we keep all the configuration and the history, but why for the proxy? Because, well, let's say if your headquarters are here in the Riga and you need to monitor some of your branches in, as example, Japan or United States, or somewhere far away, most likely the internet connection will not be the best. So it is possible that you will lose communication, the proxy and the server. What in the end could happen? Let's say You would have a graph, some data, then it will be just a gap because we lost the connection, then the data continues. It's ugly. We don't want that. That's why we have a database on the proxy side. So proxy collects the data, and what happens if there is a network communication problem with a Zabbix server? Data is written inside a database as a backlog, and as soon as the network communication is fixed, proxy is sending the data to the Zabbix server. For how long to keep the backlog? You can configure that, but the default is 1 hour, and there are like pluses and minuses in terms of choosing for how long to keep the data. You might say like, wait, why 1 hour? I want to keep it for 1 day because I can. Yes, you can, but there are some downsides, and we'll talk about that later. So that's the choice about the proxies. You need to choose the connection method, maybe active or a passive. You need to think about the ports. So the listening port of the proxy is also 151. So this one for the proxy, this one for the server. So think about the firewalls. You need to enable them. This one active means that proxy is connecting to the server, and a passive means that server is connecting to the proxy. That would be for the start. So let's actually start the installation process. What do we need for that? First of all, again, CLI, the same virtual machine that we were using in a previous video about a Zabbix server installation. And if we would run a PS, we would see that we still have a Zabbix server up and running here. So how to install the proxy? If this is absolutely new virtual machine, some clean installation, then just like in a previous video, you need to add a repo based on which version are you using and the distribution of your operating system. Also keep in mind that the proxy must have the same major version as the Zabbix server. So we have 4.0 Zabbix server, which means that we need to install 4.0 Zabbix proxy. The minor versions are compatible. So the server, let's make it 4.0.2, will be compatible with a proxy 4.0.4. But the major version, the first two numbers with a dot in between, must be the same. That matters when you choose which repo are you adding to your machine. But in our case, we already have a repo, so we already have available a proxy package, and all we need to do is simply install it. So yum install Zabbix dash proxy dash, and then again a choice of the database engine. Since in a server installation we did use MySQL, so let's do the same. Let's choose Zabbix dash proxy dash MySQL. This will again take a second or two to download a package and install it. And we can see right now that the version will be 4.0.5. So the major version is 4.0, the minor version is 0.5. And after we've installed the proxy, I've talked about a database in terms of the proxy, which means that we also need to create a new database for our Zabbix proxy. And we will be using the same MySQL database engine that we used for our Zabbix server installation. See, that's the same database. Show databases. We can see our Zabbix DB, which is used for the server, and we will create a new one for the proxy. Please never point the Zabbix proxy binary in the configuration file of the proxy to the database of your Zabbix server. It is absolutely okay to have one database engine and two databases like database Zabbix and database Zabbix proxy, but don't point a Zabbix proxy to the same database name as you have for the server, because that will lead to, long story short, bad consequences. You may corrupt your database and, well, the things will be pretty bad. So don't do that mistake. We need to create a new one. Let's create it by typing again, same command, create database. Just the name will be Zabbix underscore proxy. Then remember about a character set requirement UTF-8 and collation UTF-8 underscore bin. So create database Zabbix proxy, character set UTF-8 and collate UTF-8 underscore bin. Query OK. And the second command, we need to create either a new user or just add a permissions to same Zabbix user on a newly created proxy database. So grant all privilege on Zabbix underscore proxy dot star, which means to the all tables, to Zabbix at localhost identified by text password Zabbix, semicolon, enter, query OK, 0 rows affected, it's expected output. So we've added permissions to our Zabbix user to our Zabbix proxy database. And at this moment, we can exit MySQL CLI. Remember about a schema. So we did create a database, but it's again empty. It doesn't has any tables inside. So again, we need to navigate to cd user share doc zabbix dash proxy MySQL and the version including the minor one. Inside this folder, you will find the file schema.sql.jz. So just like in a previous video, again, we will extract it and pipe it to MySQL. But in this case, the database name is not a Zabbix, but a Zabbix proxy. So click enter. Again, it takes a second or two. And it's done. So now we need to edit the configuration file of the Zabbix proxy. Remember, all the config files are stored in the etc zabbix underscore proxy.conf, and we're looking for the parameters db user. So db name is correct, just like we created it, zabbix underscore proxy. db user is Zabbix, just like we have, and db password is nothing, blank, so we need to write it again following the syntax, uppercase, lowercase, that's important. So db password equals Zabbix. But since we are installing a Zabbix proxy on the same virtual machine where we have running Zabbix server, think about possible conflict. What is the default listening port of the Zabbix server? Zabbix server, it's 151 TCP. What's the default listening port of the Zabbix proxy? Exactly the same, 151 TCP port, which means that we won't be able to start the Zabbix proxy because we have a Zabbix server already up and running and listening to this port, which means no, we don't need to install a new virtual machine to run the proxy. We just need to change the listening port of the proxy. So in the same config file, search for listen port, and we can see a default value 151, and type a new one, listen port. Let's make it 155. And just remember about it. It will be required in some other configuration to point your agents to this proxy, let's say. If you're installing the proxy on a new machine where you don't have a Zabbix server up and running, then that's absolutely not required. You will be able to start it on a default listening port 151. So save it. And then it is also required to make some small adjustments in the Zabbix frontend. But for now, let's actually start also the Zabbix agent. That's a little bit off topic, but we'll need it a bit later. So let's open the frontend. Our IP/Zabbix. We have our frontend with just one host, and we need to go to the section administration, then the proxies. Remember that we have 5 tabs here in the frontend, and the last one which we need, the administration tab, is visible only for the Zabbix superadmins. So if you have a user permissions in your Zabbix installation, just a Zabbix user or a Zabbix admin, you won't be able to add any new proxies. You will have to ask your Zabbix superadmin to do that, or simply ask someone to increase your permissions in the front end. So when we are in the administration proxies, you need to click create a new proxy and then the proxy name. So proxy name must match exactly as in the config file, the zabbix underscore proxy.conf parameter host name. You can change it. We can change it right now, like make it um, Zabbix manual. But remember, uppercase, lowercase again does matter. So we must write it in the front end exactly the same. Zabbix with a capital Z and the proxy, but manual with a capital M. Then choose the proxy mode, active one or passive. How can we choose that in the proxy side? One of the first parameters in the config file is proxy mode. Here it is. And a default one is 0, which means 0 proxy in the active mode. That's the one that we need for this training. Active. And that's about it. Let's click add. Let's right quit from the configuration file of the proxy and actually try to start it. Systemctl start zabbix-proxy. Just like before, don't leave it as it is by just typing start Zabbix proxy and be happy that we didn't get any error messages, but check the log file. And the log files, again, var log zabbix underscore proxy dot log. So go to the bottom of the file, and what we can see, the Zabbix proxy started, the mode is active, version is 4.0.5. We can see all the features are enabled because we did that from the packages. And all of the processes started, and the most important, the last line, received configuration data from the server at 127.0.0.1, which means a local host. That means that proxy successfully contacted the Zabbix server and got a fresh configuration file, which contains information like which host do you need to monitor, which items, what's the update interval, what do you need to collect, and proxy is able to start the monitoring. In the Zabbix, we can confirm that by just refreshing the administration proxies page, and you can see the last seen 4 seconds, which means that yes, proxy is contacting the Zabbix server. And the last seen, the heartbeat signal by default happens once per 60 seconds. So if this field, the last seen age, is just constantly growing for more than 1 minute, then most likely you made some misconfiguration, or again, maybe some firewall rules are blocking your communication between the proxy and the server. The last part would be to add a host to be monitored through the proxy. And how you can do that? Just go to the configuration host, select the one which you want to configure to be monitored through the proxy, and in the bottom, look for the parameter monitored by the proxy and select which one. After the update, the proxy will connect to the Zabbix server by default each hour and request a new configuration file. And the next configuration sync will contain information about this host which proxy has to monitor. So in the end, what do we have on the screen is, let's say we have a Zabbix server, we have a proxy. Proxy is active, which means that proxy is connecting to the Zabbix server on a port 151 to request a configuration. Then we have multiple agents here, let's say in some other countries, and the proxy is monitoring those. Those might be SNMP checks, those might be Zabbix agent passive, Zabbix agent active, storing all the data in the local database here. And by default, each second, since that is an active proxy, proxy is pushing all the collected data to the Zabbix server. And Zabbix server is responsible to analyze the data, process the triggers, and send the notifications based on your actions about the problems. So that's about it. That's the magic how you can install the Zabbix proxies. And don't forget that we don't have any limitations on how many proxies you could have. There are no specific requirements in terms of the hardware. You can have pretty powerful physical or virtual machine for a big size proxies that are monitoring like thousands of the hosts, or at the same time, you could have just a Raspberry Pi somewhere on your remote branch to monitor those couple of network devices and workstations in your office. So it depends on the sizing, it depends on your needs. And yeah, that's about it. Don't forget, we indeed are listening and reading the comments below. So if you have any questions, if something isn't working, you try to install the proxy based on our manual and it fails on some steps, just ask your questions. So we will try to help you and perhaps provide some hints and explain why something isn't working as expected, or just suggest topics for the next videos, feedback, your wishes, your any stuff that you want to say to us. Click those like buttons, subscribe for the future videos, and we'll probably see you again in a couple of days or maybe a week. So that's about it. Have a good day. Goodbye.